The chaotic times in Russia after the February Revolution in 1917 also sparked chaos in the army, and the Allies were uncertain that Russia would be able to continue the war. There were Russians, though, who were willing to fight to the end, and some of the most noteworthy among them were Maria Boshkareva and her Battalion of Death. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War bio-special episode about Maria Boshkareva and the Russian Women's Battalion of Death. In the spring and early summer of 1917, even with the revolution and all the post-revolutionary uncertainty in Russia, Maria Boshkareva was the most talked about woman in the whole country. She was only semi-literate, a peasant girl from the Volga, born in 1889. Her father was a drunk and abandoned the family, and Maria began working at the age of 8 to help support her mother. She married at the age of 15 and moved with her husband to Siberia, but when he became abusive, she left him and soon followed her lover to Yakutsk in eastern Siberia when he was arrested for theft. He was arrested again in 1913. When the war broke out, Maria was filled with patriotic zeal and traveled the nearly 5,000 kilometers to Tomsk and volunteered for the Russian army. That's where the commander of the 25th Reserve Battalion was based. He told her she could only join as a nurse, but she wanted to fight, so she appealed directly to the Tsar himself by telegram, and he agreed to her request. Boshkareva was naturally muscular and was both stocky and strong, and she had no problem cropping her hair like any male recruit. She trained in marksmanship and joined the 28th Polotsk Infantry, calling herself Yashka. Bessie Beatty, a journalist from California who was in Russia in 1917, wrote, "The strength and breadth and the deep, full-toned voice of a man were hers. Passing her on the street, you had to look 3 times to make sure she was not a man. After the first few days of grumbling protest, her comrades seldom remembered she was a woman." Well, that's a little optimistic, since she apparently was sexually harassed until she had proven herself in battle, which she seriously did. The details vary a bit between sources, but she was wounded multiple times and decorated at least twice for bravery with 2 degrees of the Cross of St. George during her service at the front in 1915 and 1916. Then came the events of 1917. She was initially a fervent supporter of the revolution, but became dismayed by how little her people had actually been ready for freedom, and especially by the breakdown of order and discipline within the army. By the summer, desertions had reached an all-time high, and morale in some sectors was dangerously low. In an attempt to combat this, shock troop battalions had been formed, death battalions, with an objective being to show that the men of Russia were willing to die for their nation, and this would ideally inspire the others to continue fighting. Boshkareva wanted the women of Russia to set an example as well. They give men guns to fight, but women simply sit and wait for death. When Mikhail Rozhenko, president of the Duma, visited the front in the spring, she asked him to support her request to Alexander Kerensky, Minister of War, that she be allowed to form a women's death battalion, the first of its kind in the world. She got permission. She returned to Petrograd and held a rally for volunteers. "Men and women citizens, our mother is perishing. Our mother is Russia. I want women whose hearts are pure crystal, whose souls are pure, whose impulses are lofty. With such women setting an example of self-sacrifice, you men will realize your duty in this grave hour." That day, 1,500 women answered the call, and another 500 did after reading about it the next day in the newspapers. Boshkareva was given space at the Kolomensky Women's Institute for dormitories for her recruits. Now, many of them were rejected out of hand, and they were quickly reduced to around 500, mostly 18 to 25-year-olds. Reasons for rejection could be as simple as failing to take orders in true military spirit, or the women themselves changing their minds when she refused to allow them to set up Soviets, the councils that had been formed all over the country. She, and she alone, was in charge. The volunteers began their training, working 10-hour days, and soon their numbers were down to below 300, since many could not tolerate Boshkareva's harshness. The only concession these soldiers had to being female was that they were issued cavalry carbines instead of standard infantry rifles, the carbines being 5 pounds lighter. After completing training, they were issued standard uniforms, except theirs had a red and black cloth arrowhead sewn on the sleeve. This insignia, which was worn by male death battalions, meant that these women were willing to fight to the death for Russia. The battalion was written about in newspapers all over the world. However, not everyone admired them, as you can imagine. On the streets, they were often greeted with boos and hisses, taunts and innuendos. Still, at a huge ceremony with most of the government present, Boshkareva was given a gold and white standard bearing the words, "First Women's Death Battalion of Maria Boshkareva." She was promoted to ensign, and General Lav Kornilov presented her with a revolver, a saber, and an officer's belt. And the women went to the front to fight. As they marched to Petrograd's Warsaw Station, crowds of women turned up to pay their respects, though groups of male soldiers jeered them, and Bolshevik agitators tried to turn the crowd against them. The battalion took the train to Molodechino to join the Russian 10th Army, and on July 20th, 1917, the Russian Women's Battalion of Death went over the top against the Germans at Smorgon. By this time, much of the Russian army was in full retreat, and the Women's Battalion replaced some of them in the trenches. By the end of the 5th day of battle, most of them were dead or wounded. Boshkareva herself was wounded when a shell exploded right near her and suffered severe shell shock. Sent to Petrograd, she was promoted to second lieutenant. Emmeline Pankhurst, British political activist and suffragette, who was in Petrograd that summer, telegraphed to Britain, "First Women's Battalion number 250, took place of retreating troops. In counterattack, made 100 prisoners, including 2 officers. Only 5 weeks training. Their leader wounded, have earned undying fame, moral effect great. More women soldiers training, also Marines." Boshkareva was not really involved in the recruiting for those other battalions. Her battalion saw action in the Bolshevik Revolution, though it was a different women's unit that defended the Winter Palace. Her unit was disbanded shortly after that, and Boshkareva was twice detained by the Bolsheviks. After her second release, she made her way to Vladivostok and then to the United States, where she eventually met with President Woodrow Wilson in Washington, whom she begged to intervene in Russia. She also spent time in New York, where she dictated her memoirs, Yaska, My Life as a Peasant, Exile, and Soldier. She left the States and headed for Britain, where she not only had an audience with King George V, but was given funding by the War Office to return to Russia. She arrived in Archangel in August 1918, and though she tried to organize another unit of troops, she failed. The following spring, she returned to Tomsk, where she had first volunteered for the Russian army. There, she served under Alexander Kolchak, the leader of the White Russians, but was again captured by the Bolsheviks. This time, there would be no release. Maria Boshkareva was executed by a Cheka firing squad May 20th, 1920, as an enemy of the people. She was a remarkable woman who, in the space of a few months, went from obscurity to international fame, thanks to her dedication and her passion for her country. And her legacy remains that of a genuine, almost legendary heroine. If you want to learn more about another woman fighting with distinction in this war, you can check out our special episode about Milunka Savic right here. For more announcements and background info on the First World War, you should like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. See you next time.